anything. And one of the things that is, there is one block which is called BASIC, which is Brazil, South Africa, China, and India. Those guys got together and created something that they call the Copenhagen Accord. And the reason they call it the Copenhagen Accord was because Norway, the UK, Australia, and Mexico came up with another draft that they call the Copenhagen Agreement. And they talk about the same, but semantics, but it's mine. So they cannot agree which one to use. So what happens? Well, when you have to decide between two, you write a third one. So right now the Danish are proposing a third Copenhagen Accord/agreement for people to agree on. And what we're trying to do here is to agree that the world needs to reduce emissions before 2050 by 60% at least. And what that means is that every country needs to pledge reduction in emissions of that altogether globally will lead to a total reduction of at least 50%. So the US said, you know what, I'm not going to commit to, and they want to use also 1990 as the baseline. They want to say the world in 1990 was this much in terms of emissions. We need to use that as a baseline. So in 2020 we have the first milestone, and we're going to reduce emissions by 30%, and by 2050 we're going to reduce emissions by 60%. So the US says, no, I'm going to use 2005 instead of 1990. And I'm not going to reduce emissions by 40% as you want me. I'm going to do it by 17%. And that's when the problems start. That's when Russia says, I don't want to play with you if you're going to do that. That's when China says, I'm a developing country. I don't have to commit to anything. This has to be voluntary. And then we just saw that China is the biggest polluter in the world, but they are a developing country, so they don't really want to commit to anything. And then you have Latin America. You have Latin America that for political reasons or whatever you want, they're trying to take a central one. And then you have the president of Mexico coming and say, we're going to reduce emissions by 50 million tons every year. The guy is absolutely nuts. I'll tell you a secret, it's absolutely impossible to do that. But he believes that we can do it, and I'm very happy that he said that. Then you have Brazil. Brazil, funny enough, it's the other big Latin American country in Copenhagen, but they're not talking to Mexico. Something to do with football, I don't know. But right now, the Brazilians are pushing a different accord. They are pushing for, in their case, 40% reduction. So it's a complete mess right now. And there are some sort of good news if we manage to spin things a little bit. And the good news is that Copenhagen is going to fail. So, I mean, they're going to sign something at the end, and they're going to say, we did our best, and this is what we could come up with. So there's going to be another meeting. And the next meeting is in Mexico. COP16 is going to happen in Mexico, which means the Mexican government is going to try really hard to impress the world, just like Copenhagen did. I don't know if you know, but Denmark, the government of Denmark, put in about $100 million to impress the world about everything they have done to reduce emissions before this meeting. So the Mexican government is planning to do exactly the same thing, but that creates opportunity. So
when's it going to happen?
December next year. The whole world is going to be there, including protesters and everybody, whether they like it or not. It's going to be a mess. And right now, the mayor of Mexico City is one of the candidates to chair one of the committees, and it's all very political, very funny, but in a way, it's kind of good for Latin America because the eyes of the world are going to be there. So countries, from the president down, they are all committing resources, money, and time to these things. So maybe something will happen. So what happened? When Kyoto Protocol was ratified, people started talking about reducing emissions, right? And then I like to talk about what happened in California so you understand the context, and then from there we go to the rest of the world. What happened in California was that right after Terminator 3, no actually Terminator 2, we had a new governor in California. And the guy, he has a funny accent, but he doesn't think with an accent. The guy actually knows what he's talking about. And one of the things that he likes doing is help the environment. In 2006, he passed something called Assembly Bill 32. You ever heard of it? It's a really cool thing. Basically, AB 32 is the basis for Obama's environmental policies. AB 32 signed by the governor basically says, if you pollute, you leave the state. It's not that I'm going to fine you or I'm going to, no. If you pollute in California more than this, depending on the industry, you basically have to pay a huge, massive fine, and you need to leave the state if you don't do it. If you have a car that pollutes this much, you cannot come into the state. You can ask all the Mexican truckers what that meant for them. But basically, the governor started these very strict environmental policies. And what happens when you do that? Well, one of the things that he did was he talked to PG&E, that we all hate, I'm sure. He told them, you need to increase your renewable energy portfolio to 20% by 2012. Basically, you need to start using wind energy, solar energy, whatever the hell you want that is renewable, but it has to be at least 20% of your portfolio by 2012. PG&E has absolutely no clue how to do it, and they go to Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley is where you have all the brains, and you have all the money, and you have people like you and Rodolfo with a lot of money. And basically, people started thinking about what to do next. And then a bunch of companies started emerging out of everywhere, and VC investment started going, instead of going to software, instead of going to IT, instead of going to biotech, started going to CleanTech. And then a lot of companies started being funded. And basically, you have policy that attracted investment, investment-led innovation, and now we have a huge CleanTech industry in Silicon Valley. And just so you know how big the industry is, in the last year where we had this small financial crisis everywhere in the world, the only place with negative unemployment was the CleanTech industry in Silicon Valley. So it's kind of good for everybody. Now, everybody's throwing numbers around. Everybody's talking about how much money has gone into CleanTech, how much money has gone, and people talk about VC investment, people talk about assets. The United Nations Environment Program talks about a number which is $155 billion that came to CleanTech. Let me see, I think it's the next slide. 155 billion that came to CleanTech, and if we're talking about VC investment, most of that money went to solar companies. About $5.5 billion went to solar companies, most of them in the US and Europe. Some of that money went to wind companies, biofuel, and it doesn't show here, but a lot of that money also went to electric vehicle infrastructure companies, which is the next wave of innovation in CleanTech. In terms of asset financing, a lot of the money went to building huge wind farms all over the place. I don't know if you have seen the wind farms we have here in California. Have you ever seen one of those when you're driving from LA? They're cool, aren't they? Mexico has a few, Brazil has a few, Chile has one, Argentina is building one right now. But the investment that we're talking about here, most of it came to the US, some of it went to Europe, some of it went to China. In terms of where it went, like if we look at the regions of the world, most of the money went to Europe, the US. And in terms of developing countries, apparently, and I say apparently because if you look at the report from the United Nations, which is available online, by the way, the numbers don't add up. If you start adding the numbers, it never adds $155 billion. I have absolutely no idea where they got it from. But apparently, Asia and Oceania, how do you say Oceania? I can never pronounce that properly anyway, had $24 billion going there. And then you have South America with $12.3 billion. Mexico, they counted with North America. A lot of the money in North America went to the US. Most of the money went to the US. Some of it went to Canada. And approximately, if we put Mexico with South America, that is, if we put Latin America together, it's about 14% of the investment that went to Latin America. So we were talking at the beginning, before you came in, we were talking about sustainability, we were talking about carrying capacity, we were talking about increasing consumption, and we were talking about one of the main factors that affects consumption, and that is overpopulation. We're talking about the most crowded countries in the world, and we can start with China, and India is number 2. But if you remember the numbers that we're talking about first about carbon emissions, it's very similar. The number 1 polluter in the world is China, and it happens to be the most crowded place in the world. And then you have the US was number 2, in this case it's India, and then Mexico is number 11. We're almost making the top 10. Brazil is number 5, and then within the top 30 we have Colombia and Argentina. One of the interesting things is when we're talking about somehow analyzing how the level of consumption has increased in the world, we look, as I said, at food, we look at water, we look at materials, but we look at energy. Energy consumption is greater where you have the highest population density. And Latin America, India, and China are the poster child for population density. So it happens to be